Welcome back to the Dreamland Motel. If you're new here, this is your place to check in, tune out, and let your mind drift through the strange, the hidden, and the unspoken. If you enjoy what we do here, these long nights of whispered stories and quiet reflections, then don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And as always, you'll find chapter timestamps below, so you can move through tonight's story at your own pace. But tonight, the story is different. Because tonight isn't about dusty documents or decades-old sightings. It isn't about someone else's testimony or the fragments of evidence that surface in the margins. Tonight is about me and a journey I made. From my quiet countryside home in the UK, across the Atlantic, to the heart of Washington, DC, the capital where history is made and guarded, sometimes in equal measure. It's the story of what it felt like to finally meet the people behind the words, to step away from the safety of the bystander's chair and into the current of disclosure itself. This is the story of leaving the screen behind and stepping into the room. So sit back, get comfortable, clutch your cup of tea, and stay with me in room 9. This is the story of my trip to the UAP Transparency Hearing in September 2025. By midsummer, rumours had begun to spread. Whispers that another hearing was coming in September. They floated through live-stream chats, slipped out in the quiet corners of podcasts, and hummed in the private messages between friends who had been watching this space for far longer than I had. I had been the proprietor of the Dreamland Motel for just a month, but for nearly a year, I'd been producing the Night Shift podcast live streams every Friday. By this point, I was fully immersed. Maybe not an expert, maybe not an insider, but the phenomenon had become the texture of my daily life. And yet, I hadn't touched it with my own hands. Friends who had attended earlier hearings told me the same thing again and again. It doesn't translate to video. The feeling in the room is something else. Electric, alive. The kind of experience that gets under your skin and stays there. They told me I might even have something to offer. That with a growing audience here at the Dreamland Motel and on night shift, maybe I could carry something back across the ocean. Help spread the word in a positive way. Maybe this was my chance to add fuel to the path forward. But beyond that, there was something more human. A chance to finally meet people I had come to respect so deeply. Friends I had never stood beside in person, but who had nonetheless become some of the closest people in my life. For weeks, I talked myself in and out of it. Life in the UK can be isolating. Beautiful, yes, but quiet. My closest friends in this world lived 3,500 miles away. The pull to cross that distance grew stronger every day. On August 19th, Representative Eric Burleson confirmed the date of the hearing in an X space. I booked my flight that night. My mentor Clint booked his soon after. It felt reckless, impulsive, but sometimes the truth doesn't wait for careful planning. Sometimes you just leap. Of course, in this field, rumours never stop. A few days before departure, word began to spread that the hearing had been postponed. Scientist Eric Davis had said so on LinkedIn. For a few hours, the floor seemed to give way. That's the curse of ufology. Uncertainty. It feeds misinformation like a parasite. It stirs anxiety, corrodes trust, and leaves you chasing shadows. But within hours, the truth, thankfully, returned. The hearing was still on. Still, the damage was done. From that moment until the wheels touched the tarmac at Dulles, the anxiety hummed beneath my skin like static electricity waiting to discharge. The day of my flight began in darkness, a 6 a.m. train pulling me south through the pale grey light of morning. Countryside blurred past the window. By the time I reached London, and then another train to Heathrow, I had already been travelling 6 hours, before my flight had even left the ground. Airports always carry a weight for me, a nervous energy, a current running just beneath the surface. And though I don't want this story to be about habits or vices, I'll admit the truth. A couple of drinks helped soften the edges. Not a problem, not a confession, just part of the human kit I carry to get through the world. 8 hours in the sky left me alone with my thoughts. Doubt, guilt, and anticipation circled each other like contrails. I had left my wife and 2-year-old behind to chase the truth about UFOs and aliens across the Atlantic. On the surface, it sounds absurd. But I reminded myself how far we've come. After all, this wasn't the first hearing to take place. There had already been 2 before it. David Grush had stood before Congress under oath, his credentials unimpeachable, his testimony seismic. He said there were programs, hidden even from congressional oversight, working with craft not of human origin, biologics. That thought stayed with me at 30,000 feet. The weight of his words, the risk he took, the threats he received. If Grush believed it enough to stand there and risk everything, then I could believe it enough to sit here on this plane. And even if somehow I was wrong, even if the phenomenon was nothing more than smoke and mirrors, the friendships I had made along the way were real, and some of those people were now my closest friends. The flight itself was uneventful, but uneventful flights are fertile ground for the mind. My anxiety ebbed and flowed like cabin pressure, never quite settling. By the time I landed at Dulles, I had been travelling for 15 hours. In my head, it was time for sleep. In Washington, it was 4 in the afternoon. The air outside was thick, humid, almost alive. The metro carried me into the city, rattling like a tin can in the heat. Through the window, a BAE Systems building rolled past. A British company, of all things. Ironic. At the station, National Guard stood at the entrance, They'd be the only ones I'd see all trip. Or perhaps I acclimated so quickly that I stopped noticing. After a short walk, I reached the apartment. Cool, blessed air conditioning greeted me inside. Outside, the neighbourhood was one of those areas people say is improving. To me, it was unsettling. I'm a Brit from the countryside, where the only people with guns are farmers. In America, it feels strange to be told that you're the odd one if you don't have one. My ignorance was laid bare. I wouldn't have known what to do if one of those horror stories I'd heard had stepped out from the shadows. That first night, I ventured out for food. A 15-minute walk was enough to introduce me to the city. Sirens cut the air. Helicopters thudded overhead. People scattered on the streets, each caught in their own orbit. And above it all, rising like silent watchtowers, beautiful buildings glowed in soft orange light, penthouses glittering with glass and steel. It felt like a metaphor. Not politics, not policy, just imbalance. Sadness at street level, wealth looking down from above. And in some ways, I was one of those looking down. I carried back an oversized chicken parm, a bottle of wine, and I fell into sleep. The city would wait until morning. The morning came with heavy jet lag, but lighter with purpose. There's something you have to understand. This trip was entirely out of character for me. I've always been socially awkward. If I pass an old friend on the street, someone I haven't seen in years, my instinct is to pull my hood up, turn the other way, and escape the possibility of awkward small talk. That's who I am, or at least, that's who I was. And yet here I was, in Washington, about to meet several people I'd never stood face to face with before. People I'd only ever known through screens. And screens can't capture the weight of a human presence. The face carries something different in person, a gravity that no webcam can flatten. The thought of that first meeting filled me with nerves. So before I left, I paused in front of the mirror, looked myself in the eyes, took one deep breath. You can do this. From the apartment window, the Capitol building loomed in the distance. And as an Englishman, that means only one thing: walking distance. If you're American, you may well be laughing at me right now. I was wrong. The scale of Washington deceives you. What I thought was 20 minutes stretched to 40, maybe more. The first lesson of the day. In America, everything is bigger. Not just the buildings, but the space between them. I had stepped into a reality where even my sense of proportion felt smaller than it had back home. Still, I welcomed the walk. After 16 hours of planes and trains the day before, doing nothing but sitting in various kinds of chair, it felt good to move, though my shoes, as my feet would soon remind me, were certainly not up to the task. The Capitol grounds were not what I expected. I thought I'd find tourists, crowds, the hum of cameras and chatter. Instead, it was quiet, peaceful, almost sacred, as though the gravity of the place extended beyond the stone and mortar. The dome towered so large it eclipsed my peripheral vision, an architectural statement of power. Too big, I thought, for any one nation to justify needing. And it was here, at the Ulysses S. Grant Memorial, that I met him. You probably know him already as UAP Gerb. His work speaks for itself. If you don't, there's a link to his channel in the description. He greeted me with the kind of joke only an American could deliver with a grin. "We can see you Brits coming from a mile away." We embraced like old friends, and instantly the nerves faded. If there's one thing Americans know how to do, it's fill the silence. And I mean that as the highest compliment. It's a rhythm baked into the culture, the refusal to leave things unsaid. We English, by comparison, are quieter, reserved, sometimes too willing to accept the hand we're dealt. But Americans, they identify the problem, they raise their voices, they tackle it head on. And as someone who spent a lifetime ducking conversations, that energy was exactly what I needed. So, gladly, I followed his lead. Gerb knew the streets of Washington, knew this field, knew the weight of the subject we were both immersed in. He also had the higher subscriber count, which I mentioned with a smile, so by all rights, I was his follower, both figuratively and literally. We circled the Capitol together, exchanging small talk, at first, before diving quickly into the deep waters of ufology. Theories, opinions, experiences. The conversations that normally played out on streams and comment threads were suddenly alive, happening under the shadow of the dome itself. I clutched my camera, waiting for the right moment to ask him if I could film. When I finally worked up the courage, Gerb simply said, "No." At first, I wondered if I'd misread the situation, but I hadn't. This was the second lesson of the trip, and not the last. The refusal wasn't about secrecy. It wasn't about keeping information from the world. It was about recognizing that this meeting wasn't content. It was personal. Sometimes you need to feel a person out, face to face, before you let the camera roll. Sometimes the most important work isn't captured at all. Looking back, I realized that was the first piece of knowledge he passed on to me. These relationships matter. If shaped carefully, they can last years, decades. They can become the foundation for important work down the road. Bonding, something we overlook too easily in a culture that prizes instant content and constant output. And something I realized in that moment I had been missing more than I cared to admit. We walked the full circuit of the Capitol grounds, sharing stories, swapping theories, building trust. And eventually, we found our way into the Air and Space Museum. Now, the exhibits themselves were stunning. Planes hanging frozen in flight, NASA modules, even a Star Trek model gleaming under the lights. But the real moment wasn't in the displays. It was in the cafe. Because for the first time in my life, I sat across from someone who understood my fascination not just emotionally, but intellectually, who carried the same spark, the same curiosity, but also the knowledge to back it up. Gerb's recall is something to behold. Off camera, it's just as sharp, just as precise. A living archive of documents, dates, names, connections. And yet, without any of the arrogance that so often shadows expertise. No condescension, no gatekeeping, no sense of superiority, just clarity. It's no wonder he's become who he is in this space, a man we can rely on to bring receipts, a researcher who commands respect without demanding it. That morning taught me something important. This trip wasn't just about being in the room for a hearing. It was about something quieter, more human, about meeting people who carried the same weight of fascination, the same hunger for truth. Sitting in that cafe, coffee in hand, I felt it. Bonding, belonging, something real. Spending the morning with Gerb did more than just settle my nerves. It stirred something deeper. Because when you spend time with someone like him, it's impossible not to start measuring yourself against that dedication. You've seen his work, the depth, the detail, the sheer density of information. You might think you understand how much effort it takes to produce a documentary like his. Imagine it. Picture the hours, the endless stack of documents, the constant chase for new leads. Now double it, and then double it again. Only then are you somewhere close to the truth. This is what he does. He lives in this landscape, in the bloodstream of disclosure, within reach of the buildings where history is debated and defined. He walks these streets daily. He sifts through files, pursues whispers, connects threads. For me, the USA was a destination. For him, it's home. And standing beside him, I realized something simple but undeniable. In some ways, it's impossible for me to do what he does. I live too far away. My world is rooted in the English countryside, a reality separated by oceans, time zones, and cultures. And besides, there is little need for another investigator when we already have researchers of his caliber. But recognizing the importance of the moves Gerb makes raised a question that I hadn't prepared for. What am I doing? Gerb never asked me that. He showed me nothing but interest, encouragement, curiosity. But as we talked, the question emerged anyway, unspoken, rising up from somewhere deep inside. What am I doing? What role am I supposed to play in all this? And what is the Dreamland Motel really meant to become? The morning ended outside his hotel. He asked how far I had to walk back. 10 minutes, I told him. And then my feet reminded me of the truth. Shoes biting into my heels, a dull ache climbing upward. I started the long walk home. 40 minutes later, I reached the apartment. But that walk was more than just sore feet. It became its own meditation. Each step a reminder that journeys are always longer than they look. The Capitol Dome, that seemed so close from a distance, stretched endlessly as I moved toward it. And maybe that's disclosure itself. Always just ahead. Always visible. Yet always demanding more effort, more patience, more persistence than you expect. By the time I collapsed into the cool, air-conditioned quiet of the apartment, one thought lingered, echoing like footsteps in an empty hall. What am I doing? After a short break at the apartment, I found myself pacing with anticipation. My next friend was on his way. Dan Cleary. You may know him as the host of the Others from Another Mother podcast, or as a familiar voice on Night Shift. But for me, Dan had always been more elusive. He's one of those people who seem impossible to pin down. Not unreliable, not flighty, just unboxable. He seems to move from situation to situation as if he's caught in the wind, and yet never aimlessly. There's intention behind the way he drifts, a kind of purposeful wandering. Perhaps that's what a free spirit truly is, and perhaps, until that moment, I had never actually met one. When he arrived, the doorway framed him like a snapshot. The tattoos, the unapologetic fashion, the presence of someone who'd lived 1,000 lives in the time most of us manage one. The face was slightly different than the one I'd conjured through countless hours online. But the voice was unmistakable. It anchored him instantly in my mind, and the gap between digital and physical closed with a single word. We embraced at the threshold, and then set out to find lunch. Dan works with some of the biggest rock bands on the planet. He's a man who carries 1,000,000 stories better than yours or mine. You can sense it just being near him. A gravity of experience. An aura of, I've seen things. And yet, when we sat down at the table, surrounded by the clatter of plates and beer glasses, he did something unexpected. He let me talk. For the better part of an hour, I spilled everything. The existential storm I had carried since the morning with Gerb. The doubts about my place. The gnawing guilt of leaving family behind. The weight of wondering if I was playing a meaningful role in this unfolding story. Words tumbled out of me, unchecked, like pressure finally released from a valve. And Dan listened, not with distracted nods or polite interjections, but fully. His presence was like a container, holding everything I unloaded without judgment, without interruption. Only when I finally paused did he speak, and his words were simple, almost deceptively so. There was only one thing I needed to do. Write this episode, the one you're listening to now. That was it. No elaborate roadmap, no detailed lecture, just a simple directive. At first it felt too small, but as I sat with it, I realized what he meant. I have a habit of overcomplicating things, of analyzing them until the life drains out. I try to plan 3 steps ahead of a path that doesn't even exist yet. Dan's advice cut through all of that. Write what's in front of you. Document the moment. Don't try to carry the whole future at once. Just begin. It was like sharpening a blade by stripping away the rust. Suddenly, the shape of my task became clear. This journey wasn't about reinventing ufology, or proving myself against others. It was about this, sitting here, living it, and sharing it with you. Sometimes wisdom doesn't need to arrive with a bang. Sometimes it arrives like a quiet chord, reverberating long after the notes fade. That evening, Dan introduced me to the obvious solution to my walking logistical problem. Uber. Obviously, I should have used Uber from the beginning, like a normal person. We rode across town to meet Gerb at a bar. The city slid by the windows, neon bleeding into puddles on the pavement, the rumble of traffic underscored by occasional sirens. Washington at night carried a duality, part grandeur, part unease. Gerb and Dan had never met before, but when they shook hands, you'd never have known it. They fell into rhythm instantly, conversation sparking like flint striking steel. Two very different men, two very different orbits, yet their paths aligned as if this meeting had been waiting to happen. The three of us sat together for hours, no silence to fill, no awkward pauses, just the steady flow of theories and ideas, speculation and laughter, shared recognition that we were standing, however briefly, on the same stretch of road. There's something powerful about sitting in a room with people who carry the same fire you do. People who understand, without explanation, why this subject consumes you. It reminds me that ufology, at its core, is not just about the phenomenon. It's about people, about communities formed in the shadows of secrecy, piecing together meaning where officialdom has only left silence. Later that night, another friend arrived, Kermit, who had flown in late and joined us at Gerb's hotel. His energy was fresh, eager, ready to dive into the mix. But I'll admit, by then I was spent. My body was still on UK time, and though the clock here said evening, my mind said it was long past midnight. I was worried my fatigue made me seem distant, maybe even cold. I feared Kermit thought I was standoffish, perhaps even an asshole. But I told myself there would be more time in the days ahead to bridge that gap, to show him who I really was when I wasn't hollowed out by jet lag. Eventually, I slipped into another Uber and watched the city slide past again. The monuments glowed like silent sentinels in the dark. Roads stretched empty in places, crowded in others, a patchwork of light and shadow. It all felt surreal, as if I had stepped into a dream where the heart of government and the heart of mystery beat side by side. Back at the apartment, I sank into bed. The weight of the day pressed down on me, not unkindly, but firmly. Day 1 was done. The next morning, my body staged its first protest. The sharp pain in my left foot was still there, a lightning bolt stab every time I put my weight on it, a reminder that my shoes had betrayed me, or maybe that I had betrayed myself with poor choices. Either way, my feet had not forgiven me. Breakfast would have been the sensible option, but social anxiety made the idea of walking into a strange cafe unbearable. Instead, I turned my energy to something bigger, something I could control. I had a plan. I gathered every piece of equipment I had brought: cameras, microphones, cables, my strange homemade mesh of stands and mounts. It wasn't elegant, but it was mine. A kit not built for spectacle, but for honesty. And with it packed, I made my way to Pennsylvania Avenue. The city looked different that morning. The puddles of the night before had dried, leaving the streets crisp and bright. The temperature was perfect, warm but not oppressive, comfortable for walking if my feet would allow it. Above me, the sky held only a scatter of clouds, fluffy and harmless, like something pulled from a Pixar storyboard. When I climbed out of the Uber near the White House, the atmosphere was charged. By pure chance, I had just missed the president's motorcade by seconds. The street still buzzed with the aftermath. People running, chattering, holding up their phones, and craning their necks to catch a glimpse of something already gone. And whatever your politics, it would have been something to see. The symbolism alone, power in motion, a fleeting convoy disappearing into the city. To capture it on film would have been a thrill, but the chance had slipped away. Maybe next time. Instead, the motorcade left me only with blocked roads. I couldn't get close to the White House itself, so I turned toward Constitution Avenue, further back, more distant. From there, I set my sights on the Washington Monument. The marble obelisk pierced the sky, bright against pale blue, a spire of stone that seemed to freeze sunlight in place. Its shadow stretched long and thin, guiding me toward the Lincoln Memorial beyond. Walking that stretch, I felt the strange weight of the city. Washington is built on symbols, each monument a story in stone, each statue a curated myth. They don't just commemorate the past, they tell a nation who it believes itself to be. To walk here is to walk inside a narrative, a living archive of ideals and power. And in the back of my mind, I thought about the very topic that had brought me here, about disclosure, about how the phenomenon, too, is becoming its own kind of monument, not carved in marble, but in testimony, in the hearings, in whispers, in fragments of documents, a structure not of stone, but of mystery, a monument to something that may define humanity itself, if we could only bear to face it. I limped onward, equipment digging into my shoulder, foot throbbing with every step, heart caught between history and mystery. Day 2 had begun. At the Lincoln Memorial, I laid out my tools. The cameras, the strange lattice of microphones I had rigged together back home. To some, it might have looked like a bundle of scrap, wires bent into submission, a contraption meant to catch phantoms. But for me, it was enough. My way of capturing this moment. Now fully equipped, I began a slow walk around the reflecting pool. And after the whirlwind of the previous day, the name felt more fitting. I needed this. Time to breathe, to move gently, to let my thoughts stretch out as the city mirrored itself in the still water. For the next hour, I wandered the path that curved around the pool, recording everything. The sound of footsteps crunching under gravel, the murmur of voices carried by the breeze, the ripple of water when ducks broke the surface. Even the air itself seemed to hum. What I captured will eventually find its place in a video of its own. But in truth, the recordings were only half the purpose. Because as I walked, my mind spiraled back inward. Everyone I had met so far seemed to have a focus, a compass pointing them forward. Gerb with his relentless pursuit of documents and evidence, Dan with his effortless wisdom, his podcast, his stories. Each man carried a mission. Each man moved the needle in his own way. And what about me? Was I moving in the right direction? Was I building something that mattered? Or was I only walking in circles, like my path around the pool, orbiting endlessly, never closing in on the truth, never sure what it was I was chasing? The reflecting pool doesn't just reflect the sky. It reflects you if you let it. And in that mirrored surface, I saw my doubts, my insecurities, circling back at me with every step. Still, the power of this place was undeniable. The memorial loomed behind me, columns stark and imposing. The pool stretched out before me, a silver mirror under the sun. It was a vision almost too perfect. Picture postcard flawless, and yet real, solid beneath my aching feet. A sharp contrast to my first night in Washington, when the walk for food had shown me a very different city. Here, by contrast, was the myth of America in its most pristine form. And though I am no citizen, no participant in that myth, I could feel the weight of it press down like the sunlight. When my walk was done, I felt steadier. Not certain, but steadier. I met back up with Dan, and together we returned to the apartment. We were waiting for the next arrival. In my eyes, the guest of honor. Clint Weldon, host of the Night Shift podcast. The first time I saw him, he was a guest on someone else's channel. I don't know what it was, a spark, a rhythm, something in his presence, but it resonated with me instantly. And before I had time to overthink it, I sent him an email. It could have gone nowhere. He was getting dozens of messages at the time. Mine just happened to be the one he opened that day. Call it luck, call it fate, call it the small hinge on which large doors turn. He agreed to a video call. The first 30 minutes were awkward, full of confusion on his part. Who was this guy? What was he offering? What did he want in return? The truth was simpler than it sounded. Back in October 2024, all I wanted was to be part of something. I had seen a spark in Night Shift that I couldn't ignore. I didn't have a roadmap, or an angle, or a plan. I just wanted to help. So I offered him music. That same day, I sat down and wrote the first track. To this day, it remains the intro theme for the Friday live streams. Looking back, sending that email was a life-changing decision. Without Clint, there would be no music, no Dreamland Motel, no Washington. He has been a guide, a mentor, and more than that, a friend who helped me find my way into a world I'd only been orbiting before. When he arrived at the apartment that day, stepping through the same corridor Dan had filled the day before, I felt a swell in my chest. I could have teared up if I hadn't tried to play it cool. We embraced, me and Clint and Dan, like brothers reunited after too long apart. The three of us wandered back to the same local pub where Dan and I had lunched the day before. Familiar surroundings offered me a quiet relief. For someone who struggles with new places, repetition is a kind of anchor. and sharing a beer with two of the men who had shaped my path, one guiding me from afar, the other pushing me to strip away my doubts, felt like a moment worth holding on to. Eventually, Dan had to leave for a private event. That left Clint and me back at the apartment. 2 beers on the table, a microphone between us, and hours of conversation unfurling into the night. A conversation that may well find its way to the channel someday, after it's been sanitized by my late-night incoherent rambling. I tried once again to put into words the whirlwind of the trip so far, the existential crisis sparked by Gerb's relentless dedication, the grounding wisdom of Dan's simple advice, the questions that now chased me at every turn. What am I doing? Where is all this leading? Clint listened, brow furrowed, trying to grasp how in such a short time my entire outlook on the future could shift so dramatically. But I could tell he struggled to understand. And maybe that was fair. He hadn't walked the reflecting pool with sore feet. He hadn't stood under the Capitol dome with nerves burning in his chest. But I knew by this time tomorrow he would understand. Because tomorrow was the day of the UAP hearing. 5 more witnesses would testify, and I would hear words that would shape me further, and deepen the questions I had only just begun to ask. For now, we needed sleep. Morning would come early, and history would not wait. That night, I slept on a wire. The anxiety that had been curling under my skin since the rumours began reached a peak around midnight. We'd received messages all evening saying this hearing would be the most accessible one yet. A much bigger room, an overspill space, promises that felt too much like an invitation to relax. I knew how this world worked. The community gets messed with on a daily basis. Lies, cancellations, deliberate confusion. It's a long, well-known list. Given how far I'd travelled, knowing the sacrifices Clint and I had made, and the trust the community had placed in getting us there, nothing felt certain. The pressure to deliver, to take in, to translate, to come back with something that mattered, was palpable. At 3 a.m, I sat up. The plan to turn up at 6 a.m. felt too much like tempting fate. So I woke Clint. He grumbled at first, probably regretting the decision for half a second, and then understood. We dressed in the dark, boots on, the city outside still asleep, and caught a taxi to the Capitol. From 4 a.m. until the doors opened, we stood in line. Hours that could have been tedium became some of the easiest time I've ever spent. People talk in lines here. They tell stories. They listen. It felt like being held by a community. Strangers who are, in a way, family. The line grew from 12 to over 100. Faces I recognised from clips and broadcasts. Names I'd only seen in the credits. Chris Bledsoe. Jim Garrison. People who have become part of a decades-long chorus. By the time we reached the Capitol Visitors Centre, the checkpoints were thorough. The kind that make you feel like you're passing through an airport gate. Security, badges, the low hum of people gearing up for an official day. We sipped coffee, and tried to settle the nerves, and the clock crawled towards 10. Around 9:45, something in the air changed. VIPs threaded past the public line, their passes parting the crowd like tides. Movement, doors opening behind them. I began to understand why they'd booked a bigger room, but even that didn't calm the worry that seeped into my stomach. What if the room still wasn't big enough? What if everything we were told was a lure to spread people thin? At 10, the doors opened. Just a crack. A few people filtered in. Clint and I were next in line, and the organizer closed the doors with a hand and declared the room full. My heart dropped. Hundreds of people had made the pilgrimage, some driven 12 hours or more, and many were now left on the wrong side of a set of locked doors. We had tried to be thorough. We had tried to be early. And yet somehow it wasn't enough. When I looked at Clint, I couldn't tell if his straight, almost emotionless face was the result of a man stunned into mental paralysis, or whether, for some reason, somehow, he knew that fate was on our side, and that it would soon come to the rescue. 2 minutes later, fate slipped us the pass we needed. The organizer returned, breathless, with enough seats for us. Clint and I were the last two to get in. I still remember the small, guilty joy of that moment. We sat and watched the room that hadn't been promised to be small reveal itself. A ridiculous paradox. Half of the space was taken by the long benches reserved for Congress members, most of which would remain empty all morning. The setup felt deliberate, the proportions engineered to make the hearing appear smaller than its content. It was demoralizing, and perhaps designed to demoralize. Inside the small room, 5 witnesses were ready to speak. Jeffrey Nusatelli, U.S. Air Force veteran. Chief Alexandro Wiggins, a still-serving witness. George Knapp. Yes, the George Knapp. Dylan Borland, U.S. Air Force veteran and witness. And Joe Spielberger, from the Project on Government Oversight. From the back of the room, we watched as they stood and took the oath, and the difference between being present and watching a stream became obvious immediately. From the back of the room, from the tail end of the public seats, you could see what cameras edited away. You could see faces, micro-movements, the small human textures a broadcast cannot always hold. I watched David Grush seated behind Representative Burleson. He had a way of catching my eye, almost as if his training gave him an anticipatory sense of the room. Every time I glanced toward him, he seemed to look back. It was unnerving and oddly intimate, as if we shared an unspoken thread. But I didn't know whether to nod, smile, wink. I won't recite the testimony here. The words are public, and the links are in the description. You can hear the 6 men speak their own words. But I will tell you what landed for me, what reverberated in the space between sentences. Dylan Borland's testimony contained hints that suggested first-hand proximity to classified access. He spoke in the careful language of someone wearing the weight of sensitive knowledge, references to skiffs, the awkward weighted phrase, knowing what I know now. Watching him, I could see the tremor in his hands. After he left the room, escorted through a choreography of protection, he shook, raw, urgent, almost on the edge of collapse. Dan Cleary shepherded him through the crowd, and you could feel the pressure drop as they reached a place of relative privacy. Borland, during his testimony, said bluntly that he had weeks of financial runway left before his life would materially change. That admission, the human cost of speaking, landed harder than any slide deck. In addition, his recommendation, when asked when newcomers to the topic should begin, was one of the few moments that gave me genuine pause. "Watch the interviews with Bob Lazar," he said. Bob Lazar, the original whistleblower, invoked on this stage by someone who I believe may have first-hand experience of classified programs, maybe even someone with direct knowledge of the truth. That nod, under oath, might one day prove consequential. When the committee showed the now viral clip claiming to show a UAP being struck by a Hellfire missile, there was an audible gasp in the room. People drew breath as one. For many in that space, a video with military provenance still carries a peculiar charge. Personally, I've grown wary of the idea of a video as a smoking gun. The era of video evidence feels overripe. Still, a live reaction is a thing of its own. The room's pulse transformed for a moment, a communal shiver that you simply cannot feel the same way through a feed. There were tender human moments too. Borland's extended applause and the smile Luna shared, genuine, luminous, were small fractures of joy in the otherwise forensic atmosphere. They reminded me why being there mattered. The applause had weight. It reverberated through our bodies. It landed differently than any online comment ever could. After the formal testimony, we moved in the flow of people and found ourselves briefly meeting Jeremy Corbell. He was working the edges, rushing. Dan introduced us. He stood with us for minutes that felt like a lifetime and a blink at once. And then he had to go. The exchange was short, but it mattered. You could see the network, the machine of people who move quietly, urgently, without fanfare. Watching Dan work that day was instructive. The man is more than a raconteur or an instigator. He has the kind of presence that arranges safety without fuss. He handed Clint and me a piece of gum when our mouths had gone dry from the long morning. He moved witnesses in place, made sure people were fed in small but essential ways, and never asked for credit. If anyone in that room deserved a quiet medal, Dan was that person. He coordinated, protected, soothed. He was one of the most important people there, and yet that importance was never shouted. When we left the room, the city felt different. The air was charged in a way that had nothing to do with humidity. We had been witness to something messy human, but undoubtedly consequential. And we had been lucky enough to be there, to feel it from the inside. The lines, the locked doors, the gasp as the missile struck a frame. The truth, when it is not only heard but felt, is a different thing entirely. Walking out of the Capitol Visitors Centre felt like leaving a theatre after the last applause. The sun felt different, warmer, somehow kinder. I could feel its weight on my skin, and for the first time in days, let myself feel it properly. The anxiety that had been a constant hum inside my ribs evaporated into the air. We had done the thing we'd come for. We had been where history might be inching forward, and that fact landed in me like a small benediction. For about half an hour, we did nothing but stand in the sun. Clint and I just let the sunlight bathe our faces. My eyes grew heavy in that way they do after a long, intense performance. The soft exhaustion that follows giving everything. I called my wife. Hearing her voice felt like finding shore after a storm. I said goodnight to my 2-year-old, 5 hours ahead in time, and 1,000 small worlds away. The call was ordinary and sacred at once, a tether back to the life I'd left for a few days to chase questions. There was nothing left to plan, nothing left to prepare. All that remained was to process and to measure, and for that we gathered the people who could help us sort the night into meaning. Gerb, Kermit, and a new face, Rob Jones. Rob arrived with the kind of dry wit that hit like a practiced echo. My first encounter with him, he was mid-sentence, making some snarky remark I can't even remember now. But I do remember thinking, oh, he's one of those types. 10 seconds later, I realised I was wrong. He was not a caricature. He was one of the most piercing minds I'd ever sat with. His background? Naval nuclear work, which is about as specific as I can get, given my ignorance on the technicalities of a career like that. His fiery interest in ufology cost him his career. I don't know the specifics. I wouldn't ask. His perspective of ufology was exacting and unsentimental. Over lunch, Indian street food that ranks easily among the best I've ever eaten, Rob dismantled, reframed, and reassembled many aspects of the hearing into clearer pieces. Gerb and Kermit supplied the context, histories, dates, and the sort of archival scaffolding that makes new testimony fit into the old frames. We talked for hours, and it was during this time I could, in real time, see Clint's revelation experience unfold, just as mine had 2 days before. Perhaps an appropriate analogy, it's like receiving one of those famous downloads that abductees often talk about. Between mouthfuls and notes, people checked on me as if sensing the slow pull of sleep at my edges. I was content in a way I hadn't expected. Full, held, taut. Fate had given me something rare, a day that felt both like a capstone and a beginning. In those hours I understood something else. I had learned more in those few days than in the previous 10 years of reading and watching on screens. The in-person textures, a tremor in a witness's hands, a face that didn't match the video, the offhand comment that suddenly reframed everything, had weight you can't download from the internet. My role in the story remained undecided, but here, in this half-sunlit restaurant, surrounded by people who had lived this space differently, the edges of what that role could be started to feel less jagged. That evening, we did one of our best live streams on night shift. On camera, something was different about me. Not the showman, not the armoured producer, but a softer cut. A man who'd just been through something and come out slightly steadier. Everyone watching seemed to notice it. The chat filled with comments about how I seemed lighter. I wasn't just tired. I was relieved. It wasn't just the physical need for sleep. It was the small desire to recline, to close my eyes, to smile for no reason, but to feel the warmth of the moment. After the stream, we went out for a final dinner. I'll keep the specifics of that meal in the part of my head reserved for private treasures. A memory folded inward, quiet and perfect. We exchanged embraces that felt too large for the space they occupied. The long, repeated hugs that tried to compress gratitude, apology, promise, and farewell into a single moment. Clint and I walked back to the apartment together, the night soft around us. For the first time in the trip, we allowed ourselves to plan nothing. We slept as long as our bodies wanted, the kind of sleep that unknots things. When I woke, the city would still be there, monuments and rumours, testimonies and dark corridors of power. But something in me had shifted. The good moments had been recognised as they happened. That was new. That was rare. And that, more than any snippet of video or viral clip, felt like the entire point of being there. The last morning, it was just me and Clint. I suppose it was always going to be that way. From the very beginning, he had been the man responsible for getting me here. The man who answered my email when no one else did. The man who gave me a chance, and with it, a path. We found ourselves in a booth at a small spot near the apartment. Breakfast tacos on the table, and a strange cocktail of coffee and Coca-Cola in front of me. For the record, it was disgusting. But maybe that's part of the charm, part of the memory now sealed in amber. We talked for an hour, then another, and another. The plates shifted, the glasses changed. Coffee gave way to cocktails. Cocktails gave way to tequila. The booth filled with the kind of conversation you only have with someone you trust implicitly. The kind of talk you reserve for long friendships. Though the reality of it was, we had only been standing face to face for 2 days. We laid everything out on the table. Aliens, free speech, politics, capitalism, healthcare, racism, the whole spread of human messiness and hope. Nothing was too sacred to touch, nothing too sharp to handle. And woven through it all was the thread that pulled us both to this place. What can we do? Not as content creators, not as podcasters or researchers, but as people, as friends. What value do we bring? Where can we make a difference? Over a shot of tequila, we made a promise, a plan. I can't share it yet, not here, not now, but it exists, and it carries forward the spirit of those conversations. Provided all goes well, you will hear about it soon. When it was finally time, we stepped outside. The magical taxi arrived, my last Uber of the trip. Clint and I embraced for the longest time. A hug waited with everything we had shared and everything still to come. It was my turn to head to the airport. His turn to spend the evening as I had spent my first night in the city. Quiet, contemplative, alone with the meaning of it all. If he's anything like me, I know even now he's still contextualizing everything. The pieces keep shifting, almost a week later, finding new shapes in memory. My 17-hour journey home began the way all journeys do, in motion, in limbo. But this time there was no anxiety, no frantic checking of timetables, no gnawing fear of missing the moment, just the continued steady warmth. At the airport, I picked out a teddy bear for my daughter, a small thing, soft, harmless, expensive, and it brought tears to my eyes. This trip had been life-changing, but in the end, my real life was still waiting for me, just one overnight flight away. The mystery of the phenomenon, the friendships, the history, they would all continue. But for now, there was one truth I knew beyond question. The path forward isn't only about answers in the sky, it's about who you walk beside when you go looking. This episode didn't come with dramatic close encounters or alien face-offs at the window. There are plenty of those stories already, and I promise there will be more from me in the future. But tonight wasn't that kind of tale. What I wanted to bring you was something quieter, and in some ways harder to describe. The feeling of what it's like to step from behind a screen and into a room where the people and the words you follow every week are suddenly real and human. For 4 short days in early September 2025, the rumours and clips that live online became flesh and breath for me. Theories turned into conversations, videos turned into faces, and that change, small, ordinary, and easily overlooked, is the thing I keep returning to. Yes, as a result of my trip to Washington, I double-check the front door is locked. That visceral thread of unease is real. But the deeper impression I carry home is the friendships, the hands we shook, the coffees we shared, the people who spent hours listening without an agenda. Those human ties are as real as the phenomenon itself, and they matter. If we are to move toward truth, and I believe we must try, we're going to need each other. We'll need to learn how to meet face to face with care, to trade credentials for trust, to recognize a person behind a username. There may be difficult days ahead. There may be risks. I don't know what's next, but I do know I don't want to be alone if something difficult arrives. So thank you. Thank you for letting me tell this story as I lived it. Thank you for indulging the small, honest moments, the embarrassments, the joys, the long walks and the bad shoes. If anything from this trip is worth sharing, it's this. The work of disclosure isn't just in hearings and files. It's in the quiet work of holding each other up, of listening, and of returning home with a little more clarity than we had before. If this episode resonated, please like, comment, and subscribe. Share your own small thing stories in the comments. Maybe a time you recognized a good moment as it happened. My trip to Washington, D.C. for the UAP hearing was a good moment. And to everyone that contributed, be that financially, emotionally, some even offering to travel halfway across the country to offer support, thank you. Until next time, from the Dreamland Motel, check in, tune out, and sleep well.